Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Saturday morning webinar. If you are here in Hong Kong or on this side of the world, so glad that you could join us. And apologies, first of all, for the confusion with the Zoom link. I'm extremely happy that the colleagues and students that I'd hoped would join us did see that message and have joined us. Thanks so much. It's the subject that we're going to deal with today is both familiar as well as distant. Familiar because the things that we're going to discuss, geopolitics, West versus the rest, ideological conflicts, as well as how this relates to domestic situations in societies that are less than democracies, are intimately familiar to those of us in China or on its fringes. But it's unfamiliar because we're going to hear about a context that we don't read or talk about much in this part of the world, which is a very important context, of course, and that is of Turkey. So I was delighted to discover this forthcoming book by Bilge Yesil, Talking Back to the West. And we are going to have the privilege of hearing from her about the key ideas contained in this book. She is Associate Professor of Media Culture at the College of Staten Island and at New York University and City University of New York. She is the author of other books as well, including Media in the New Turkey. And it is the evening for her. So glad that she's made time for us today. Bilge.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Cherian, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming here and joining me on a Saturday morning, right? It's Friday evening here in New York. So without further ado, I'm just gonna share my screen and PowerPoint. As Cherian has noted, this is mostly about how authoritarian regimes and also non-Western actors or those actors from the global South kind of talk back to the West. That is how they, try to legitimize themselves on the world stage and how they criticize the West and how they try to reshape the emerging post-Western world order. So I'm going to be focusing on, some similarities and, differences between mostly Turkey, Russia, and China. But of course, because the heart of my book is about Turkey, I will be focusing on Turkey's state-led global communication program. The book is titled, as Cherian has mentioned, Talking Back to the West, How Turkey Uses Counter-Hegemony to Reshape the Global Communication Order. It's forthcoming this June from University of Illinois Press. And I'm very excited to be talking to you today. As I said, I will make references to Chinese and Russian global communication initiatives, but the book is not a comprehensive comparison or a comparative analysis between these, three countries and their state-led global communication efforts. However, throughout the book, when, relevant, I, make those references to the similarities between the three countries as well as others. So just to, put things in a, give some background information. Of course, you're all familiar with this. China and Russia, along with other non-Western countries, BRICS and whatnot, have been growing their political, economic, technological, and or military presence around the world. And this has also coincided with the perceived decline of Euro-American hegemony in international affairs. So the West-led global order has been seemingly eroding as a result of several developments, especially, the 2008 financial crisis, Brexit, and the uncertainty surrounding the future of the European Union, and then election of Trump in 2016, and the United States' subsequent withdrawal from its commitments to liberal democracy. And of course, during this time, 2015, 2016, and onwards, the refugee crisis, the migrant crisis, however you want to name it, the resurgence of ethno-nationalist movements and far-right extremism resurfacing on both sides of the Atlantic. So altogether, these developments also presented, like countries in the global south or non-Western actors, including Turkey, with new possibilities to assert themselves more aggressively or more proactively on the world stage. And again, as you're all, like familiar, these countries, China, Russia, Turkey, and India, I know Daya is here. They're all, like in their own ways contesting and reshaping, trying to reshape like the Western power, Western hegemony, and global leadership. And there's also a, like significant amount of dissatisfaction with existing global governance structures and institutions that is shared by these countries. Importantly, they're also all, post-imperial states, right? That is their successor states to once mighty empires. And as Nora Fisher-Onar says in her work, they also have experienced this moral injury vis-a-vis the West. That is, these post-imperial states, their predecessors have lost battles, have faced, like political setbacks, and almost, like near colonization by Western powers, which have all left enduring scars on these, on these states. Moreover, as they try to legitimize their actions, domestic and foreign policy actions in the eyes of the global community, they also respond to and try to delegitimize Western criticisms, especially those criticisms about, like human rights violations and authoritarian practices at home. So as they try to, like do this, like legitimation work and criticize the West and respond to Western criticism, they're obviously operating within this Western-dominated international system. So according to Fisher-Onar, they're all trying to reaffirm their ontological security, and they're constructing narratives that emphasize specific glories and traumas from their imperial past. I think, like we're all familiar with, like how Russia and Putin, like have been disseminating these particular traumatic or glorious experiences from, like history. And in the case of Turkey, as I will be talking about, like in a little while, this is the Ottoman Empire. So these narratives invoke a sense of world historic grandeur, and obviously they play an important role in how these states position themselves as resurgent great powers, right? That heritage, that legacy, how they're kind of, like reviving it. And also presenting themselves as these, like new alternatives to Western powers. And at the same time, and I'll be speaking in more detail about this, they're trying to aim their, global South interlocutors that, like imperialism is exclusively Western. And even as they are pursuing, like authoritarian, sub-imperialist or neo-imperialist projects in their neighboring regions, as Russia is doing, as Turkey is doing, or elsewhere around the world, as China is doing, and pursuing these, like expansive or expansionist political, economic, and or military projects, they are also trying to legitimize these actions and just, like attributing, imperialism to the West alone. So having, like giving this, having given this background, let me say a few things about the this legitimacy work or this promotional activity. So oftentimes, to disseminate these favorable narratives, to project power, to promote themselves, these countries, like as we all know, undertake cultural educational diplomacy programs, public diplomacy programs, provide development aid, or engage in humanitarian aid, invest in global communication, which is, like the subject matter of my study. And of course, there is a very long history of such efforts. Speaking of global communication, like we can go back to, like BBC World, different, like language services from BBC or Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Moscow, what have you. And as, of course, you know, after the 1990s, we've seen the proliferation of these non-Western actors. So, you know, like now we have Chinese initiatives, CGTN, China Radio International, China Daily, Xinhua, and from Russia, we have Russia Today, Sputnik, and all of these, you know, like offer, you know, English language services and in other languages, Arabic, Spanish. They also take communication infrastructure development, and this is especially true for, you know, like China, in Africa. Again, journalism training programs. This has a long, you know, like history during the Cold War. You know, like Africa was kind of like this battleground for different journalistic models between, you know, like Western liberal journalistic model and, you know, like even, you know, like Russian model, national security oriented models. So although these have a long past, I'm not going to talk about this, but China is obviously undertaking a lot of journalism training programs all around the world. And there's also, you know, like several digital sovereignty initiatives, especially led by China and Russia. And obviously, when it comes to digital misinformation campaigns, election meddling, weaponization of information, especially, you know, like with Brexit and the US presidential elections in 2016, all these activities have been, you know, like linked to Russian state operatives. So these are also the areas, you know, like international broadcasting, knowledge production, communication, infrastructure development, journalism training programs, digital sovereignty. These are also areas where Turkey is asserting itself more strongly and investing a lot of, you know, technical and human resources, which I'm going to talk about next. So although, you know, like Russia and China have, you know, like more experience and more expansive global communication efforts, Turkey is kind of like a newcomer in this realm, but it has definitely been expanding its activities. So Turkey's global communication initiatives, as you know, like as I mentioned earlier, obviously this is what all countries do, right? Western or non-Western, European, American, you know, global South countries. They all try to promote the country and create global influence for it and legitimize its domestic and foreign policy activities, and also promote its own, you know, like history or civilization. And on the flip side, they also criticize their foreign adversaries. What I want to focus on a little bit is how they delegitimize their Western critics and try to discredit the West. So when I was working on Turkey's global communication activities and its, you know, like relationships with, you know, like the Western discourse or Western media or Western policy circles, what stood out for me was how much effort there was to delegitimize Western criticisms of Erdogan or Turkey. So every time there was something in the New York Times or in the Guardian or, you know, Deutsche Welle that criticized Erdogan as authoritarian or undemocratic, they immediately labeled it as, you know, like Orientalist and Islamophobic, etc. So I was interested in seeing, you know, like where this was coming from. And in time, you know, like as I you know, like watched and read and listened to and followed on social media these, you know, like Turkish activities. By the way, all of them, you know, like for the purposes of this book, I focused on English language activities. I also realized that, you know, like there was a lot of effort put into discrediting the West, right? So when it comes to Turkey's and, you know, like Russia's global communication efforts, they're both generating critical narratives regarding the West. And they're both trying to foster doubts about, you know, like Western media, Western, you know, like secret agendas or Western values. In Russia's case, especially on Russia Today, they're doing this via, you know, like endorsing a lot of, you know, like anti-Western conspiracy theories. But, you know, like Turkish outlets are not doing that. But the common ground is, you know, like this generation of critical narratives about the West. Turkish outlets also aim to rectify Western misrepresentations of Turkey and of Erdogan's government, explain its stance and, like the country's values and whatnot, and promote its achievements. And this is similar to the Chinese initiatives that, like this constructive communication model, if you like. As I said earlier, Turkey's presence in the global communication landscape is, like more recent, but it has been expanding very rapidly. Obviously, like Turkey's international radio network or state-run news agency, they have a very long history going back to the 1920s and 30s. And in the 1990s, Turkey has also established English language or Turkish language international satellite television to reach out to, Turkish workers in Europe or Turkic communities in Central Asia. But what happened during the AKP era, when Erdogan came to power, especially starting in early 2010s, there was a lot of effort to promote Turkey as a regional power in the Middle East. And this, of course, had to do with how Turkey was promoted first by Western policymakers, like as the Turkish model, the model for Arab nations during the Arab uprisings, that it was a successful model that blended, like Islam, market democracy, and liberal values. Although this was, like a misguided model, we can, like talk about that, a misguided portrayal. It was nonetheless embraced by both Western policymakers and, like the AKP government. So, like the AKP government was kind of, like taking, like capitalizing on this. It was trying to present itself as this regional power in the Middle East and also a reliable partner of the Western alliance, because Turkey has been, like a member of, like NATO and, like the Euro-Atlantic Alliance since after the Cold War, during the Cold War, sorry. So in the early 2010s, Turkey used its newly established Office of Public Diplomacy. The think tank said Turkish state-run television, TRT Arabic and TRT Kurdish. These were all, like newly launched in the 2010s. By the mid-2010s, especially after the Gezi protests, the massive anti-government protests in 2013, the tide started turning, and it turned dramatically for both the AKP and the country's image. So after the Gezi protests, Erdogan consolidated political authority on the Kurdish issue. He went back to, like securitization paradigm. And the AKP was also supporting Sunni factions in Syria during the Syrian civil war. All of these, like drew extensive scrutiny from Western media and policy circles. So in contrast to early 2010s, when Turkey was applauded as, like this role model for Arab nations, by mid-2010s, it was suddenly described as this, like country on an authoritarian path, or, like going through this democratic, like sliding into a dictatorship and whatnot. So the AKP officials, Erdogan, they found themselves really compelled to rectify this worsening image. So the one important factor was to counteract this negative coverage in Western media. In order to do this, they undertook concerted efforts to expand the country's presence in the global communication order. And moreover, it was the same around the same time, 2013, 2014, Erdogan was starting to undertake an ambitious geopolitical economic agenda. And Also, they were trying to expand its political and economic presence in the global South. So all of this necessitated an effective communication with global South publics. So then TRT World, Turkey's first English language news channel, was launched in 2015. An English language newspaper, Daily Sabah, was launched. Bosphorus Global, a digital communications project. So today we have, as I said earlier, TRT World, the first English language communication network. Anadolu Agency is the state-run news agency, provides services in 13 languages across like dozens of offices around the world. Voice of Turkey offers service in approximately 40 languages. And all of these activities are coordinated by the Directorate of Communications, which reports directly to Erdogan. And then in addition to these state-run organs or state-run entities, there are also commercial entities, commercial outlets that provide, news and information services in English language. These are commercially owned, but as you can imagine, they're owned by loyalist businessmen that are, very, very pro Erdogan. So we have Daily Sabah, the English language newspaper. It's also available online. Its sister television service, A News, it's available online, and Yeni Şafak English, a newspaper in English language, which is also available online. Then there is SETA, which is the pro-Erdogan think tank. Although SETA presents itself as, like an independent think tank, it is not. It is financed by, like a mixture of state funding and funds that come from, again, loyalist businessman. SETA has offices in Washington, D.C., Brussels, and they organize international panels. They have a lot of, English language publications, etc. So they are also engaged in a lot of, knowledge production and communicative activities. Bosphorus Global is run by a pro-Erdogan pundit, and she's also a board member at TRT, the state-run Turkish Radio and Television Corporation. And Bosphorus Global engages in digital communication projects, a lot of, digital communication activities, some of which are, close to, disinformation and misinformation activities. And they also undertake a mixture of PR activities, engaging with, foreign journalists on behalf of Erdogan. In addition to all these, news and information and knowledge production activities, Turkey is also taking, is expanding its footprint in development communication. So there's a lot of, media assistance and journalism training programs that are offered to especially media professionals and organizations in the Balkans, Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. So there is that very particular focus on Global South media organizations and media professionals. A lot of times, they invite them to Turkey for these journalism training programs, or they go, this is J4J, Journalism for Juniors. They go to, high schools or universities in different countries, again, in these regions, Balkans, Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa, to train high school students or university students as journalists. Again, the idea is to give voice to these young emerging journalists, and claiming that their voices are not heard. And obviously there's television series, maybe you're familiar with these, but these have been really, really popular around the world, especially, in my book, I examine the ones that are financed, produced, and or broadcast on the state-run television channel and pro-Erdogan commercial channels, but these are also sold to different countries. Some of them are available on, all of them are, some of them are available on TRT World's YouTube channels with, dubbing, English dubbing, or subtitles in Arabic, Russian, and Spanish. Maybe you've heard of Resurrection Ertuğrul, Diriliş Ertuğrul. This was on Netflix and it became a global hit. So for this book, I also interviewed, audience members, especially Muslims in a global South, and tried to figure out, what is the where's the popularity of these series coming from? Because they're almost always about, Ottoman or pre-Ottoman sultans, warriors, heroes, and there are, quite a number of parallels between, Erdogan's narratives and these series. And almost, all the Muslim audiences that I interviewed, they all said, their number one reason for, popularity of these series is because for the first time, they see Muslims and Muslim men especially as heroes, not as terrorists, right? So that is, the typical representation of Muslims and Muslim men, especially after 9/11. So this is kind of, a counter argument, right? Muslim men as, honorable and as heroic, and definitely not as terrorists. If you're interested in this angle, we can, talk about it in the Q&A. So as I said earlier, not just Turkey, but, China, Russia, and, all countries that engage in this kind of global communication, they obviously try to shape a favorable perception of the country and create global influence. And this is true for Turkey. So these entities actively promote Turkey's accomplishments and present Turkey as a prominent actor in conflict resolution and humanitarian aid and development assistance. And additionally, they strive to validate Turkey's domestic and foreign policy choices, especially those that are prone to attracting scrutiny from international media or policy circles. So in addition to doing all this legitimation work and trying to project the country in a positive light, they are also discrediting the West or criticizing specific, obviously they are criticizing specific countries that are Turkey's adversaries, and this depends on, the whatever's happening in the realm of international affairs. It could be, like France or Germany or United States or, like Greece or European Union as a whole. But there is also this, underlying and general criticism of the West and Western hegemony and the unjust global order that the Western powers have built. For example, during the peak of the refugee crisis in 2015 and 2016, Erdogan called European leaders, shameless and immoral for not fulfilling their humanitarian obligations. And yes, he was right. And I'm going to talk about this later. And the Turkish, outlets and, the newspaper, the English language newspaper, the English language news channel, SETA, the think tank and whatnot, they were also criticizing whether the Western civilization could still be upheld as a role model for the rest of the world. In the aftermath of the Brexit campaign and Trump's election in 2016, they capitalized on the sense of, of this sense of malaise and in the Western world that permeated European and American politics. So there's a lot of, questioning of, is Europe failing? This is a report about the, missing child refugees in Europe. And Erdogan, as you can see here in this one, he always brings up, what happened in Bosnia and, the Srebrenica massacre. So there's all this, references to, the Western civilization and civilizational values, which I'm going to, come back in a little while. So when they criticize the West, or when they're like interrogating the West, they're also covering the challenges that afflict the Western liberal democracy. So in recent years, this has been mostly, like focusing on, like racism, like Black Lives Matter, which, like Russia Today has covered in detail, right? Or far-right extremism in Europe, income inequality, Islamophobia, right? What happened in Canada, with its indigenous population, and other America's gun violence epidemic. So they're also strategically, while doing all of this, they're also strategically reminding audiences of the historical transgressions committed by the West. So this is mostly about, like reminding audiences about Western colonialism, or, like Nazism or the Holocaust. So these are, like, as Erdogan says, these are the sins of the Western civilization, right? So the objective here is to interrogate the perceived superiority of the West, and then obviously present Turkey as an alternative to this Western power. So I argue that beneath these efforts to discredit the West lies a deeper agenda of interpolating Muslims and rallying them under Turkey's purportedly benevolent leadership, and that this benevolent leadership of the Muslim world, or the Ummah. So to this end, there is also a lot of effort to promote Turkey as a benevolent guardian, as the voice of the voiceless, as the advocate of the global South or the oppressed peoples, right? And of course, this again has to do with going back to what I said at the beginning about this, the moral injury that they experienced vis-a-vis the West, right? There's always this, like harkening back to the Ottoman Empire as, and its, like legacy and the Ottoman heritage, and something that, like Turkey has inherited from the Ottomans, and now is, like resurging as this great power, as this benevolent guardian. So the depiction of the West as immoral, power-driven, and dishonest becomes, like important here, because it, like it serves as a strategic tool for Erdogan to position himself and to position Turkey as the guardian of Muslims. So in the book, I look at, like the coverage of and the commentary on knowledge production and, like several communicative activities regarding Islamophobia and the refugee crisis. And in all of these, like cases, there is this, like emphasis on West as, like immoral and hypocritical and dishonest, which, is true, right? As we've seen since October during Israel's, like genocidal campaign in Gaza, and, like how Western leaders have been complicit in this. So this is not really something you can argue against, right, on a factual basis. But my point in the book is, like how all of these are being instrumentalized to present, Turkey as forging a fairer world, which again, like has all these connections to the Ottoman past, which make up the bulk of the messaging in the television series. That's why I, like put them side by side, because there's this, like red thread that kind of runs through all of this, right? As this benevolent, harmonious empire, the Ottoman Empire, and how, everyone lived, like happily and in this, like just order under the Ottoman Empire, and how Erdogan is trying to, like rebuild that fair global order, that just global order. There's a lot of emphasis on justice, not democracy, right? But a just world. And I have a few more slides, and I think I'm almost out of time. I'm just gonna try to wrap up and make a few other points. So as I said earlier, I focused on, like the coverage of Islamophobia, refugee crisis, and, like the coverage of far-right extremism, racism, police brutality, George Floyd protests. So in all of this, there is, like a lot of emphasis on the notion of civilizational dualities between Turkey and the West. So these are, like just versus unjust, moral versus immoral, good versus evil. And, like a lot of, like duality or binary opposition between Western civilization and Islamic civilization. So as I said earlier, they portrayed West as morally flawed and hypocritical and in decline. And then the next question is, like, why should we tolerate being lectured by Western leaders about human rights or democracy? And concurrently, they project Turkey as the champion of the voiceless, right? So both Erdogan and his communication emissaries use this term a lot, voice of the voiceless. So voiceless in this case refers to those who experience political, economic, and social marginalization, especially at the hands of Western powers. And then at the same time, they're projecting Turkey as a rising power that is capable of challenging the Western hegemony and creating a more just global order. So now, of course, you might ask, but, like, isn't the West hypocritical? Isn't the West pursuing its self-interest? And isn't it morally corrupt? Like, look what's happening in Gaza. And, like the US and European governments are complicit in a genocide. And yes, like we know what happened in Srebrenica. We know what happened with, like Western colonialism and imperialism. So the argument I make in the book is that, this is not just your, like typical state propaganda, but I call it strategic obfuscation, right? So they're always, obviously, Turkey's global communication apparatus, it's different, like components. They all highlight, like these powerful truths: Islamophobia, the Holocaust, colonialism, Western military interventions in the Middle East, and, like Afghanistan and Iraq. And, like these are undeniable. Yes, like all these things happen and, like keep happening. But the way these are covered or commented on, or the way the ways in which, like knowledge is produced about these truths, right? Their complex underpinnings and implications are obscured, right? And they're almost always reduced to binary oppositions, right? So the good versus evil, like moral versus immoral, Islamophobic West versus, like benevolent Turkey. And these, like developments, if you like, or these, historical truths, like they're almost always imputed to the character, to the lack of faith of, like of the West or the Western civilization, that there is something inherently wrong with the Western character, right? Or with the Western civilization, that's it is in them, right? It's not about, like racial politics. It's not really about, like the rise of far right. It's not really about, like resurgence of ethno-nationalism, but Islamophobia is just about this good versus evil. So then the message is, like, then, like if the good actor, right, the benevolent actor rises, right, then this problem can be solved. So what I mean by strategic obfuscation is that, like, this is not about fabricating falsehoods. It's not about, like spreading lies. And they are using facts, right? And that's why I think we should be, like careful not to confuse any of this with, like genuine counter-hegemonic communication. They are using facts, but they're using them in a selective manner, right? As per Erdogan's preferred narratives, right? And they are excluding certain other facts that could disrupt these narratives. So to finish, Erdogan's emissaries always present their communication activities as crucial steps that are aimed at disrupting Western media imperialism, to rectify the power imbalances within global communication flows, to restore justice to the oppressed people of the global South and give them a voice, right? And in all of this, like we see how they use the language of post-colonialism by making references to agency, representation, and decentering the West. But all of this, like is very much instrumentalized, right? They are not undertaken for purposes of, like democratic or humanistic objectives. Yes, there's a lot of criticism of the West and a lot of attention on how the West is violating its own, like values, right? Its own standards. But this is, like not a humanistic critique, but an instrumentalized one. And the notion of the voiceless is very selective and exclusionary. For example, in Turkey's global communication apparatus, there is a lot of emphasis on Islamophobia in the West, but there, like when it comes to persecution of, like Uyghur Muslims and, like China, they are almost silent, right? They're also, like portraying the geopolitical economic ventures of Turkey in the global South as these righteous endeavors in order to, like bring balance to the world order, to forge a fairer world, as Erdogan notes. So there is this, like motivation by self-interest and a deliberate disregard for Turkey's own, like dangerous policies, but not a sincere commitment to democratizing global communication. So as I noted earlier, there's, like these are instrumentalized, right? Islamophobia is an example of this, and other instances of Muslim suffering, so that, like Turkey can portray itself as a champion of justice and as a defiant actor that is standing up against the West, right? When Turkey, expands its political and military involvement in Syria or Libya, it amplifies the humanitarian aspects of its foreign policy and present themselves, as I said, righteous endeavors. And as Turkey consolidates its grip on media outlets within the borders of Turkey, it is at the same time presenting itself as an advocate of media professionals and organizations in Global South, and offering them, like assistance and providing them with journalism training programs. So let me just finish with a final word on the implications, and we can talk more about this. So does all this obfuscation, right, of complex social, political, cultural phenomena, it reinforces binary identity constructs, and it perpetuates these civilizational dualities, like Huntington's civilizational clash between Muslims and the West, but this time it's, like from the other side. So in this era of, like post-truth, and where, like disinformation and misinformation present great challenges to, like democracy, this global communication apparatus should not be just regarded as, like purely counter-hegemonic, or as an extension of Turkey's public diplomacy efforts, but recognized as, like a venture carried out by this, like power-driven regime. So that's it. I think I went a little bit over time. I'm sorry. Just gonna stop my screen share here. Okay. Thank you.
Bilge. That was no, it's understandable that it took more than half an hour, because it's not a small or simple country, right? And these are big issues. I want to kick off the Q&A by returning to that comparative focus. Yeah. What I gather from you, say if we just compare with China and Russia, is this, correct me if I'm wrong, but the media outreach efforts of non-Western actors obviously have similarities, but also interesting differences, right? So, for example, researchers who have looked at Russia's RT found that they changed strategies from more than 10 years ago, because they realized, unlike maybe Tucker Carlson, that it's actually quite difficult. I mean, the Russians themselves realize that it's difficult to sell a positive message that makes Russia more to the world, right? And it's kind of like beyond reach. So instead, RT goes mainly on the attack to spread doubt and cynicism about the West among not only non-Western audiences, but also even within Western publics, to kind of demobilize them and so on. China, in contrast, rightly feels that it has many positive stories to tell about itself, alongside its attacks on the West. Yeah. So would I be correct? And this seems to be what I'm getting from you, that the Turkish model in this sense is sort of closer to the Chinese approach, which sort of combines the wolf warrior tendencies along with panda diplomacy, right? Rather than the much more sinister Russian style.
Yes.
That'd be great, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
the other interesting, that's I guess more of an observation. The question I have for you has to do with whether it is meaningful to think in terms of the West versus the rest, these emerging powers and so on. It seems to me that, of course, it's not as if Turkey, China, and Russia are a bloc, right? They're not necessarily allies, and far from it, right? And compared to the others, Turkey actually wants Western European acceptance, say more than China or Russia. And also the other interesting point does this affect the tone of the media and communication outreach? That's one question. Related to that, China-Turkey relations, am I right that in addition to Turkey seeing itself as a leader of the Muslim world, it's of course a leader of the Turkic world, and therefore feels very, very deeply the injustices to the Uyghur community in China, right? Is this a big part of its external branding that is both, of course, probably very sincere, but also, as you say, instrumentalized?
Yes, yes. So let me start with your first comment. Yes, the model is more, if we can speak of a model, because this is fairly recent, right, compared to what China and Russia have been doing, right? So this is, we're talking about this expansion of this apparatus, mid or early 2010s, right, as Turkey's foreign policy was changing. So it is still developing, but in a lot of aspects, I think it's closer to that Chinese, constructive model, right, promoting the country as this, rising power, and it's just, and it's, benevolent, and it's, humanitarian. There's a lot of emphasis on Turkey's humanitarian aid. As a matter of fact, Turkey was just, I think, the second or third country, that gives out, humanitarian aid. But there's not a lot of, conspiracy theory peddling as there is on Russia today, right? And there is also not a lot of, deliberate misinformation or disinformation campaigns that are taken by, Russian operatives. It is also, I think, closer to Chinese model in terms of, the journalism training programs and a lot of, development communication activities. And it is, Turkey's, I think, competing with, China in terms of its presence in Africa, right? So yes, obviously similarities and divergences. In terms of, China, Russia, and Turkey, obviously they're not a bloc, but this has to do with a couple of things, the transformation of Turkish foreign policy in 2010s under Erdogan's foreign affairs minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu, right? Who basically, transformed Turkey's traditional, pro-Western, strictly pro-Western foreign policy to opening it up in, what he called, strategic autonomy, that, Turkey, yes, it is a reliable partner, Turkey will still be, aspiring to European Union membership and will still be, a partner of, US and Europe and NATO and whatnot, but it will also open up its relationships, or open up to the rest of the world, right? So then early 2010s, we see this expansion of diplomatic efforts and diplomatic presence in the Middle East and Africa, and all of this has to do with Davutoğlu's vision of the strategic depth. It goes back to Ottoman Empire, and Davutoğlu saw Turkey and Ottoman Empire as existing in this basin, right, between these different civilizational basins, right? Western civilization and, like Africa and Asia and Turkey, like being right in the middle. And it was kind of geared towards, that foreign policy was geared towards, like reviving that Ottoman legacy, that Ottoman heritage, right? And since then, as Turkey was kind of, trying to enter into new, like partnerships with, like Russia and China, and, like increasing its, like geopolitical presence in Middle East and Africa and Balkans, obviously, because of the Muslim population, right? Obviously, like a lot of significant events, like happened, Arab uprisings and Syrian civil war, right? And now the invasion of Ukraine and what's happening in, like Gaza. And this foreign policy has not always proven, like 100% successful, and has actually put Erdogan and Turkey in, like really in dire circumstances, right? But Erdogan is a very pragmatic man, so um, you know, um, Turkey is still, for example, continuing its, like trade relations with Europe. European Union is Turkey's #1 trading partner, but there's also a lot of anti-Western rhetoric because of, like political reasons, right? The relationships with the US deteriorated after 2010 because of US support for, like Kurdish guerrillas in their fight with ISIS, right? So it's kind of, like very, uh, it's been very, very challenging, right? So yes, there is a lot of anti-Western rhetoric and, like sometimes very anti-Western moves, foreign policy moves. And it is also trying to establish or forge stronger relationships with China, right? Because of, I mean, like, Erdogan several years ago mentioned that, like what the repression of, like Uyghur Muslims is an example of genocide, but that was several years ago. With the deteriorating economic situation in Turkey, now it needs to increase or boost its trade relationships with China, and China has supported, like has given some, like I think, if I'm not mistaken, some, like major, like financial loan. So it doesn't really want to upset China, right? And it's, like it is treading on, like these waters, and a lot of times it is finding itself in these uncertain circumstances, right? That's why I say, like that notion of the voiceless, or the notion of that oppressed, right? Advocating for these oppressed peoples, that's very selective, right? So it is easier for him to say, like, oh, France is, like Islamophobic, and, like, look what Europeans are doing to our, like Muslim brothers and sisters, but he cannot, like do it with, like China and Russia, because, like Erdogan expressed his intention to join, like Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So the foreign policy is an important determinant in all of this, right? And this foreign policy is, like a lot of times is, like their controversial decisions, or, like is on shaky grounds, right? But as you noted, there is also, like a kind of sincerity, right? All of this is not just, like instrumentalized. I mean, like, yes, it is this guardianship of the Muslims is an important tool for Turkey and for the Erdogan government, but there is also a long history, right, behind us. And that's one of the things I'm exploring in the book. And that is why I'm, like, I adopt a cultural framework, not just an IR, international relations framework. I'm acknowledging this, that, like all of this is, yes, like mobilized by foreign policy and what's happening, like in terms of its international relations. But I also didn't want to look at all of this as yet another example of public diplomacy, or yet another example of this, like geopolitical, like wrestling between these, like great powers or middle powers. Yes, there is that, but I also show how there is this, like long-standing cultural and historical grievance towards the West, right? And that's Turkey's very complicated relationship with the West, especially going back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, right? So starting in late 19th century, I'm not going to go back into a lot of history, don't worry. But since late 19th century, with the rise of, Turkish nationalism and, also Islamism, right? And then during the early years of the Turkish Republic, the rise of, political Islam and this, grievance or this notion of in the book, I discuss, the sense of, Muslim victimhood, right? Either Muslim victimhood at the hands of the West, right? Going back to this trauma of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire because of Western imperial encroachments, right? Or this Muslim victimhood at the hands of the Westernizing elite, Ataturk, during the early years of the Republic, right? So there's also a lot of, Islamic populist messaging here, right? Who's the oppressor, who's the oppressed, who's the good, who's the evil, right? So to go back to your question, yes, there is a lot of, it is driven by foreign policy, but there is also this, undercurrent, right? This cultural, historical, identitarian undercurrent that is, feeding all of this. I don't know if that
Right.
helps.
So certainly, and I'm wondering whether I don't want to hog you, so I'll move to other questions, but just to throw in the point that perhaps one way to feel the pulse of what you call these cultural attitudes would be to look beyond state or government captured media and even the diaspora Turkish media, is there concern about not just the Muslim world, but also Uyghurs in China and so on. So obviously a lot of research for people like you and others to do. But let me turn to questions from the audience, including one that refers to from Minos. What about the legacy of Mustafa Kemal? Does Erdogan want to get rid of it? How does that play into the media?
This is a good question because so in in Ataturk for Erdogan and his proxies and his voter base, right? The pious Muslim Turks, there are almost like two different persons, right? So one is Mustafa Kemal, right? Who fought the Turkish independence war against the invading armies. So this is after World War I, right? Ottoman Empire is collapsing, and Greek, British, and French armies and Armenians, right, are not Armenians, I'm sorry, Italian, Greek, British, and French armies have invaded the Anatolian heartland, right? So this is a very, very traumatic experience for Turks, right? And Ataturk, back then Mustafa Kemal, right? Mustafa Kemal led this independence war, right? So he is seen as this, as this hero who fought against the Western imperialists, right? And who saved the Anatolian heartland, right? From Western imperialists. So that is Mustafa Kemal. And Erdogan, AKP officials almost always refer to him as Mustafa Kemal, right? Focusing on his role as this, the leader of this liberation movement, right? But what happens after the founding of Turkish Republic in 1923, then Mustafa Kemal becomes Ataturk, and he is given this name, like the father of Turks, and he's carrying out all these top-down westernization programs. And this is obviously a terrible thing for pious Muslims because they have to change the way they dress. They have to change the way, they read and write in Arabic, and they have to change their, public religious traditions, right? So everything changes, right? They cannot have their, like Islamic schools and whatnot. So that top-down westernization program and that, like suppression of like pious identity or Islamic identity in the public space, that is obviously something that they are not fond of, to put it mildly. And that's why they never refer to him as Atatürk. So that legacy is something that they are not, like very happy about. And I mean, one of Erdogan's key messages and, like one of the key reasons, like he came to power and he has been able to stay in power for so long, despite all the corruption and economic instability and, like, and whatnot, is because he has promised his base that, those days of top-down westernization is over, right? They cannot tell us, like how to dress, right? So now women can wear, like headscarves in government offices, and they can be employed in, like government agencies, right? So this right to, like the right to religion, the right to express oneself as, like pious Muslims in the public sphere, right? It's almost as if, like turning on its head this top-down Western. I mean, obviously the top-down Westernization program has not been, like overturned, but giving back some of the rights that have been taken away, right? Especially wearing the headscarf, right? Or not being treated as, like these marginalized second-class citizens by the secularist establishment, right? So that is, I think, one of the reasons why he has been able to stay in power. And obviously, like all of that, like top-down westernization and secularization, Atatürk, that's, like that part they're not fond of, right? But Mustafa Kemal as the liberator, right? As this, like liberator fighting against the imperialists. That is the persona they like and that they like to promote, right?
Again, the parallels with other countries trying to do this kind of ideological work are striking to me because, as you say, it's common to see this reaching back into history for so to reinvent and to repurpose the history for current needs. But it seems like it is actually easier to go further back in history, right? Because the last few decades of leaders, whether it's of China or or Russia, can be some of the aspects of their biography can be and their role in the nation building can be problematic. So it's always easier to go further back, right? And I think this also the how relevant is everything that Mao did or Mao's legacy to today's China. It's kind of part of itself. Kind of,
in Turkey, like especially over the last 2 decades, but more, like pronouncedly over the last, like 10 plus years, there has been this, like government-led interest in all things Ottoman, right? So much so that, like you have said, like they've gone back to, I don't know, history books and pulled out these obscure battles the Ottoman army fought against the British. But they said, like, oh, like we had this victory against the British in Iraq in, I don't know, 1910, but no one knows about it. Like now we need to celebrate it as another holiday. Why don't we, right? So there's always
the Chinese and the Indian government as well is doing this, right? So going back.
Yeah. And actually,
let me turn to a couple of questions from the audience. One, let me find it. Sorry. Yes. My question is, have you interviewed anyone living in Western countries to see if they also believe this narrative of Turkey as the voice of the voiceless? Secondly, have you come across anyone in Muslim countries who says something like, I don't think their action matches the narrative they're promoting? Turkish.
Okay, Yeah, that's a very good question, because it also gives me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my methods. And so this study is not, like an audience reception study, right? In other words, I did not ask people, I did not interview people, or I did not, conduct surveys to see if, like all of this international communication work, like really did promote Turkey or not, right? In other words, I did not look at how it is received, right? Either by Western audiences or by, like audiences in, like Global South or Muslim audiences, except for the television series, right? This was because this was partly, I mean, these are obviously important questions, right? But this was beyond the scope of the book, because I did want to, like start with exploring the political economic structures and the ideational frameworks, right? And the cultural historical underpinnings of this global communication apparatus. That was my objective, right? So does it grant Turkey any legitimacy? Is it positively perceived? What do people think about all of this? I really did not like look at any of that. As I said, it's outside the scope of the project, not because they're not important questions, they are, but I think for starters, right, and I was more interested in, like, where is this coming from? What is happening, right? Who is funding all of this? And it's mostly, like Erdogan's, like it's state organizations, state organs, and also Erdogan's, like loyalist businessmen. So it's a small, like coterie of people, which I call Erdogan's communication emissaries. And then I was also interested, like I said, I wanted to go beyond that, like typical public diplomacy framework. And, like I was interested in, like, what is happening with all of this, like talking back to the West and like chest thumping, if you like, right? So yeah, unfortunately I cannot answer that question, but
Don't expect you to do everything, but yeah.
yeah.
Let me turn to a question from, sorry.
Yeah, one of the things that I, like came to realize as I was, like doing this study over, like several years is, and this question was always asked, like the people always ask me, like, oh, okay, but, like the people because it's the English language content that I'm looking at, right? And I always got the question, oh yeah, but, like Westerners, like people in Europe or in the United States will not believe any of this, right? And then, like I said, like, but yes, it's an English language, but the target audience is not necessarily, like the white European American audiences, right? It is the third generation Muslims living in diaspora, right? And obviously English is the lingua franca, right? If they are able to poach some, like white, and I'm using this term very broadly, white Western, audiences, I don't know, from Russia Today, from, like France 24 or BBC, okay, great. But their target audience is the global South, is the Muslims, right? That's why there's all this rallying effort, right? So that's why I wanted to title it, like talking back to the West, because yes, on one hand, they're talking back to the West, and then they're using that, look how we're talking back to them, right? We are the new powerful, state actor on the global stage, that we are, like now this resurgent rising power, that we have the means and the ability to talk back to these powers, right? So, yeah.
There's a related question about language, which you mentioned, from Lynette Lim of University College Dublin. Lynette studies Chinese internal and external propaganda, and she says, I found that overall, Xinhua Chinese edition tends to be more aggressive and belligerent in tone than Xinhua English edition on the same
Yeah.
issues and topics. Do you think there's a similar contrast between Turkish language and English language Turkish media?
Yeah. So first, let me say that, except for the English language newspapers that I mentioned, right, that are published by loyalist Erdogan businessman, all of these, like TRT World, the English language news channel, Anadolu Agency, etc., they create their own original content, right? Or SETA, the think tank, or Bosphorus Global, whatever they're doing, like reports, policy papers, conferences, etc. It's all their, like original content, like the documentaries, the news programs. The newspapers, and this is mostly due to, like lack of staffing, right? English speaking, like native journalists are hard to come by in Turkey and hard to employ in an openly pro-government entity. So a lot of times their op-eds and their news stories are translations of the Turkish versions, right? And that's why I noticed that, when I look at TRT World's coverage, it's more, let me say, subdued, right? But when you look at the coverage in Daily Sabah, it's more, like kind of aggressive, because the original one is, like in Turkish.
Right.
But they don't have a problem. I mean, like TRT World, of course, wants to present itself as this, independent public service broadcaster, right? And it is not. I mean, like that's how it has recruited a lot of international foreign personnel. It has poached a lot of people from Al Jazeera English, right? By telling them, like, oh yes, we're an independent public broadcaster, but actually it's working as a state organ. But so they obviously want to present themselves as this more, like reliable, credible news source, right? On the other hand, Daily Sabah, the English language newspaper, does not really have a problem with that. And I interviewed, when I interviewed some people who worked at Daily Sabah, they told me, like, they don't mind coming off as, like aggressive, right? Because it's kind of like a bonus for them, right? Look how we're talking back to the West, right? Not going to be lectured by them, right? Yes, we're going to call them, like Nazis and fascists, and like because we're not the old typical, like Turkey, right? That is used to being lectured. Now we are, like lecturing them, right? So that's my that would be my response.
So actually, sparking controversy might not be seen as a bad thing because it's partly
Yeah,
performance. And I think that's evidence from both this Chinese wolf warrior research as
exactly.
well as RT.
I see a lot of,
Yeah.
I see a lot of similarities with that too, especially I think what I haven't done a comparative analysis of this, but I would like to. Coverage of events such as, like George Floyd protests, right, in the United States. I remember, like Turkish officials tweeting and almost, like having a field day with all of this. Haha, look at, like the American police, how they're beating protesters. And I read something about, like, I think how, like similar tweets from, I think, Chinese officials were coming, right? Please, respect the rights of protesters, and almost this, like kind of, like
Right.
mocking way. Yes. And
To
every
end,
time.
sorry, to end with, can I that we have several questions actually that are more in the vein of your advice with regards to media literacy and political literacy. One comes from Dian Long from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Says that some criticisms of the West might not be entirely unfounded. But because they come from authoritarian leaders, we may doubt their credibility. So how can we discern genuine or accurate criticisms when they come from less credible mouths like China or Turkey? And so there are other questions that are in the same vein. Alfred Hong from Singapore asks, how do we differentiate facts from falsehoods? What's really neutral and so on. And an earlier question as well has to do with, who should we believe? What sources of news should we be turning to?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And this is one of the points that I'm making in the book. And as I said, like they're not lying, right? Yes, like Western colonialism has wreaked havoc on, like many parts of the world. And, like, yes, there is rampant Islamophobia. And this is all true. Like you cannot argue against these things, right? But I think this selective nature of, like attention is important. So I think the audiences should ask themselves, like, okay, yes, I'm seeing a lot of documentaries about Islamophobia in Europe. And I watched all these documentaries and I would not, like when I watch them, I say, yes, this is what's happening, right? But then I think audiences should ask, okay, why don't I see any documentary about, Islamophobia or persecution of Muslims in China, right? Why don't I see any, like a documentary about, like, I don't know, the oppression of, like Palestinians as Muslims, right? Why isn't there a documentary about that, right? But why am I seeing so much emphasis on the West, right? I think those instances can, like reveal that, like that selective nature, right? And also it's important to I think, like, again, this is the burden is on the audiences and, like receivers' shoulders, right? Why is this, like authoritarian regime trying to promote itself as this, like bearer of, like justice, right? While it is doing so much injustice, right? And human rights violations and undemocratic practices against like the Kurds and, like religious minorities and LGBTQ people in Turkey, right? There is so much hate speech coming from, like Erdogan himself and government officials, right? Against LGBTQ people. And then how come a regime that does this at home can go and present itself as the bearer of, like humanitarianism abroad, right? So that would be my response. But I think if one pays attention to this, like unbalanced coverage of, like one topic that focuses, like on one, like national or regional context and disregards others, I think that could be, like an opportunity to, like see this instrumentalization and selectivity, right? I mean, yes, we see Islamophobia and we see anti-refugee sentiments, and we see rise of ethno-nationalism everywhere, but why focus on certain parts of the world, right? And this is also, as I said, it all depends on like the foreign policy and international relationships with these countries, right? So when relations with France were, like at a very, very low point, like they were, like obviously going, like after, like Macron and what he said about Muslims and whatnot. And then, like there was a quieter period, right? When there were tensions with Greece in the Aegean Sea, there was a lot of emphasis on how badly the Greek Coast Guard treats the refugees and pushing them back, which is true, right? But, like, why does, like certain topics get more coverage, right? Than others and, like at certain times.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess when observing the Western, I mean, but even if some states are right to call out Western hypocrisy, that does not make them necessarily less hypocritical, right?
Yes, and I think I mean when I like finished the manuscript and sent it to the press, and it was like in the final stage. So all of this was before October 7th, right? I mean, like I could have easily written another chapter if I had the time on like Israel and like Gaza and Palestine, right? I mean, right now, Turkey, like continues its trade relations, like 100% with Israel. Nothing has changed, right? But the Erdogan is obviously fuming against Israel. And, like, is he right in fuming against Israel? Yes, right? And a lot of my friends, like the American and European friends have said, like, oh, like I watched TRT World and they're doing a great job covering what's happening in Gaza. They have on the ground reporters and, like their coverage is as good as Al Jazeera English, right? And then I say to them, yes, but do you also know, like what is going on, between Turkey and Israel in terms of, like diplomatic relationships, in terms of, like trade relationships, right? So who knows what will, like what will happen in terms of those trade relationships, right? And how that will affect, like the coverage, right? So it's, yes, it is, like a lot of these, like instances of coverage or commentary or knowledge production activities, it is driven by obviously foreign policy and bilateral relationships. But there is always that, harping on the, like anti-Western grievances, right, from Muslims and, like kind of capitalizing on that.
Thanks so much. We'll end it there. We've gone over, but I could go on, but I don't want to detain you longer than you than we have a right to. You need to get on with life in the evening, and I just want to say that we very much look forward to the publication of your book.
Thank you.
And wish you all the best in your ongoing
Thank
research.
you.
So thanks so much on behalf of all of us.
Thanks, Jerry, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming and the wonderful questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, good night.